Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The courtroom was solemn, its white marble walls reflecting the cold light from the chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The benches were filled with lawyers, reporters, and citizens watching an ordinary case, or at least, that's what they thought. Michael Johnson, a 13-year-old black boy, walked slowly to the center of the room. His eyes shone with an intensity few adults could match. Behind him, his father, David Johnson, a former Army officer, watched him with pride and concern. The tension was palpable, every breath seemed to resonate louder than the whispers of the audience. Judge Margaret Whitmore, known for her apparent impartiality and rigidity, looked up from her files. Little did she know that this teenager was about to turn her life and the lives of the entire courtroom upside down. Michael placed his hands on the desk, took a deep breath, and said in a clear, sharp voice, You're a murderer." Time seemed to stand still. The pens fell, the whispers fell silent, and all eyes turned to the boy. The words, simple but terribly powerful, carried the weight of a truth no one had dared to speak. Michael wasn't shouting out of hatred. He wasn't seeking to destroy, but to expose the injustice that had cost his mother her life. Each syllable echoed like a clap of thunder in the hushed silence of the courtroom. Even Judge Whitmore, accustomed to accusations and impassioned debates, felt a cold chill run down her spine. It was the beginning of a confrontation that would go beyond a simple court case. On that day, a 13-year-old boy showed that truth and courage could challenge authority, and that even in the most solemn places, the voice of the oppressed could be heard. Michael Johnson stood before Judge Whitmore, his gaze fixed on her. The courtroom, usually alive with whispers and the rustling of papers, had become a sanctuary of silence. Every spectator held their breath, as if a fragile moment might shatter at any moment. You're a murderer," Michael repeated, louder this time, his voice vibrating with anger and suppressed pain. The lawyers exchanged incredulous glances. Even the prosecutor, Adeline Carter, raised a slight eyebrow. The whispers resumed timidly, but the weight of the words prevented anyone from speaking. Judge Whitmore, adjusting his glasses, tried to regain his usual calm. His voice, soft but authoritative, broke the silence. "I ask you to respect the court, young man. This language is unacceptable." Michael raised his head, defying authority, but with no hatred in his eyes. "No, ma'am. It's not me who's unacceptable. It's what you allowed. You let the real culprit in my mother's death walk free. And no one did anything." A shudder ran through the room. The audience exchanged shocked glances. Parents, lawyers, and journalists seemed to be asking themselves, how can a 13-year-old boy have so much courage? David Johnson, Michael's father, clenched his fists under the table, proud but anxious. He knew his son's pain and anger, but he also knew that this moment could change their lives. Prosecutor Adeline Carter approached quietly. "Michael, can you calmly explain what you mean? If you have evidence, we need to hear it." Michael nodded, taking a deep breath. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice didn't waver. "I'm going to tell you everything. Every piece of evidence you ignored. Every lie that allowed my mother to die. You're going to see that the court failed you. And you have to answer." Judge Whitmore looked away for a moment, aware that the entire room was watching her reactions. For the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her decisions. In the heavy silence, one thing was clear: this was no longer just a trial. It was a battle between a boy's truth and a judge's power. And Michael, despite his young age, had just taken the initiative. Michael straightened, his dark eyes staring at Judge Margaret Whitmore. The words he was about to speak were the result of months of courage and preparation. Each syllable carried the weight of his pain and determination. "My mother, Angela Johnson, should never have died like this," he began, his voice shaky but firm. "The real culprit was protected. You, Madam Judge, ignored the evidence. You let justice fail." A shudder ran through the room. Even the most experienced lawyers exchanged worried glances. Prosecutor Adeline Carter placed a hand on Michael's arm, silently encouraging him to continue. The security cameras show exactly what happened. The witnesses you refused to hear, they knew everything. You knew my mother was in danger and you did nothing. Judge Whitmore pursed her lips, searching for the words to reply. She was used to authority and control, but never had she been confronted by a young boy confronting her with her mistakes so directly and publicly. Michael took a small folder out of his pocket. He opened it and handed the documents to the prosecutor. These are the reports you ignored. Every call, every complaint, every warning, all of this proves you knew and did nothing. Adeline Carter quickly flipped through the documents, her eyes widening as she discovered evidence that had been intentionally excluded. The room, previously silent, seemed to hold its breath. Even the jury, composed of adults accustomed to complex legal cases, was struck by the boy's courage and lucidity. Michael didn't look down. His voice now sounded confident. You called it due process, but to me, to my family, it was injustice. You are responsible for his death, Your Honor. And today, you will hear the truth. A murmur ran through the room. Journalists were feverishly taking notes, aware that this testimony would become a national event. The stunned spectators understood that this boy, so young yet so lucid, had just transformed a simple trial into a confrontation between truth and power. Whitmore took a deep breath, aware that every decision she made now would be scrutinized by everyone. For the first time, she felt vulnerable, watched, and judged. Michael, however, knew he had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer a child facing a system he didn't understand, he was a fighter for justice, armed only with his voice and the truth. The courtroom seemed to vanish around Michael. His eyes, still fixed on Judge Whitmore, were lost in the memories that had led him to this moment. He saw his mother, Angela Johnson, smiling despite the fatigue of her long days as a nurse at the Chicago hospital. She had raised Michael alone since the death of his housekeeper friend, teaching him discipline, honesty, and courage. She often told him, "Truth and justice are always worth the fight, Michael. Even when no one listens to you." Michael remembered that fateful day a few months earlier. His mother had received a threat that she had reported to the police, but the case had been closed too quickly. Not enough evidence, the officers had told her. Yet Michael knew there was evidence, witnesses, recorded calls, and official documents. But it had been ignored. That day, Angela came home crying, terrified. Michael, then 12 years old, took her in his arms and promised her, "Mom, I will make sure justice is done. I will not let anyone hurt you." Then came the irreparable. Angela had been murdered outside her home by a criminal protected by corrupt authorities. Michael had found her body, and since that moment, he had never been the same. Pain had turned to anger, and anger to determination. Back in the present, he felt his fists clench. Every glance in the room reminded him why he was there, for his mother, for justice, and so that no one else would suffer the same fate. He took a deep breath and said aloud, as if to break the inner silence that was suffocating him, "My mother was murdered because you turned a blind eye. Because you chose power over truth." Judge Whitmore, sitting behind her desk, felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time, she saw not an angry boy, but a wounded soul, determined to get to the truth. The silence in the room became almost tangible, as if everyone present held their breath before the force of Michael's sincerity and courage. Each word was an arrow, each accusation a mirror reflecting the mistakes of the judge's past. This flashback had transformed Michael. He was no longer just a boy accusing a judge, he had become the embodiment of delayed justice, the voice of a victim the system had forgotten. And in that suspended moment, everyone in the room understood that nothing would ever be the same again. Judge Margaret Whitmore sat behind her desk, her hands clenched around her dark wooden gavel. For the first time in her career, she felt the fragility of her authority. Michael's words still echoed in her mind. "You are a murderer." She looked away from the pile of files on her desk, hoping to find refuge in the paperwork that had always protected her from reality. But even the documents seemed to mock her, silent witnesses to her hasty decisions and carelessness. Every report she had ignored, every appeal she had rejected, now came back to haunt her in the voice of a 13-year-old boy. Whitmore took a deep breath, trying to mask her confusion. She had always been known for her thoroughness and fairness, but never had she faced such a direct accusation. Michael wasn't just an angry child, he was precise, methodical, and every word he spoke was a blade slicing through her ego and pride. Prosecutor Adeline Carter spoke to calm the tension. "Madam Judge, Michael has important information. We must hear it so that justice can be done." Whitmore nodded slowly, knowing she couldn't stop him. Every gaze in the room was on her, the jury, the reporters, the citizens present, all watching intently. And at the center of this storm, Michael stood tall, courage and pain etched on his face. She remembered her own beginnings, when she had sworn to protect justice and defend the innocent. Where had that woman gone? She had let the system transform her, and now a young boy was showing her the reflection of her weaknesses. Michael, sensing the judge's wavering, spoke again. "You're not just responsible for my mother's death, you're responsible for everything you ignored. Every plea, every warning, every piece of evidence you dismissed, it allowed him to continue to hurt." Whitmore closed her eyes for a moment. The boy's voice wasn't a simple accusation, it was a moral condemnation, an implacable mirror of her own conscience. And in that moment of truth, she understood that the power she had always boasted of was worthless in the face of justice and truth. The room held its breath. Michael had just transformed a courtroom into a place where guilt and innocence were no longer decided by robes and gavels, but by one boy's courage, pain, and truth. Whitmore knew that every decision she made from now on would be scrutinized by the world. And for the first time, she was afraid. The courtroom remained tense, with every spectator hanging on Michael's every word. But as the boy began to reveal the details of the injustice that had cost his mother her life, a quiet movement caught everyone's attention. Prosecutor Adeline Carter, an experienced woman respected for her integrity, stood up and gently placed a hand on Michael's arm. "Michael, we will review all the evidence you have gathered. You have the right to be heard," she said in a soft but firm voice. Michael's eyes shone with a mixture of gratitude and relief. He was no longer alone in his struggle. Carter scanned the files the boy had brought, letters, phone calls, reports from witnesses Judge Whitmore had ignored. Each one told a story of inaction and neglect. In the courtroom, some spectators began to murmur among themselves, astonished by the boy's audacity and the strength of his evidence. Even one of the defense attorneys, silent from the beginning, gave a slight nod. For the first time, the pressure seemed to be shifting from Michael to Judge Whitmore. Michael spoke again, his voice trembling but determined. "You said it was just a trial, that I didn't understand justice. But it wasn't me who failed. It was the system you represent. And now everyone will know." The murmurs turned into a respectful silence. The journalists present frantically took notes, sensing that this story would shake the media and the public. Some spectators, moved by Michael's courage, nodded in silent approval. Whitmore, on the other hand, felt the weight of every stare. Her past decisions were laid bare, and every mistake she'd made seemed to flash before her. She tried to regain her composure, but every move Michael made, every piece of evidence he presented, was a stark reminder of the pain she'd helped perpetuate. Adeline Carter addressed the judge. "Ms. Whitmore, I believe it is time to take these documents and testimony seriously. Ignoring this evidence would be a serious mistake." The judge lowered her eyes, knowing she could no longer run from the truth. Michael, encouraged by this unexpected support, felt his confidence grow. He was no longer just an angry boy, he was his mother's voice, the symbol of justice delayed, and now he had allies to amplify his voice. In this courtroom-turned-theater of truth, one thing was clear: the fight for justice was only just beginning, and Michael Johnson had no intention of backing down. Michael took a deep breath and placed the small file on the desk. His hands were shaking slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on Judge Whitmore. He knew this was the decisive moment. "These documents," he began, "show everything you ignored. Every call from my mother reporting a threat, every warning from neighbors and witnesses, all of it was ignored. You knew she was in danger, and you did nothing. Adeline Carter quickly flipped through the files and frowned. The evidence was overwhelming, official reports dismissed, testimonies ignored, messages and calls ignored. Every piece of evidence showed that Judge Whitmore had, through negligence or political will, allowed the culprit to act with impunity. Michael looked up at the room and said in a firm voice, "Here is the proof of what you refused to see. And if you think your power protects you, you are wrong. Today, everyone will know." A murmur rippled through the room, followed by a heavy silence. Reporters frantically took photographs and notes. The jury, shocked by the obviousness of the documents, exchanged worried glances. Even some of the defense attorneys, accustomed to strategies of manipulation and delay, seemed unable to dispute the clarity of the evidence. Judge Whitmore felt panic rising. Every piece of evidence Michael held up was a mirror to his past mistakes. She tried to answer, but her voice trembled slightly. "These documents. It's not exactly." Michael interrupted him gently but firmly. "No, ma'am. That's not exactly. It's the truth. You failed to protect my mother. And now you have to answer for it." Adeline Carter stood up and addressed the room. "This evidence cannot be ignored. It clearly shows the negligence that led to Ms. Johnson's death. We must act with justice and transparency." The spectators, motionless and attentive, felt the weight of every word. Michael, despite his young age, had transformed an ordinary courtroom into a place of revelation and moral confrontation. Whitmore, feeling her authority waver, realized that this was no longer just a legal trial. It was a moral judgment, and this time, she had no escape. Michael had taken control of the truth, and every word he spoke drove a wedge between her and the world she had tried so hard to protect. For the first time, the court was dominated not by the robe or the gavel, but by the voice of a boy determined to get justice for his mother. No sooner had the hearing ended for a break than reporters rushed into the lobby, cameras in hand. Michael Johnson's words were already echoing through the city, and soon, the entire country would hear them. 13-year-old boy accuses judge of murder, ran the headlines in local newspapers and online news sites. Videos of the most powerful moments of the hearing circulated quickly on social media. Internet users were amazed by the boy's courage and the clarity of the evidence he presented. In the courtroom, Judge Margaret Whitmore felt the weight of every stare. Television cameras were now pointed at her, and her past decisions were laid bare. For the first time, the world saw what she had always hidden behind her authority and her black robe, serious errors and negligence that had cost Angela Johnson her life. Michael, for his part, was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had unleashed. But his father, David Johnson, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, son. Your mother would have been proud. You spoke with courage, and now the world is listening." The spectators in the courtroom, who had been struck by Michael's strength and lucidity, were beginning to realize the extent of the upheaval. The murmurs turned into heated discussions, some praised the boy's courage, others criticized the judicial system. But one thing was certain, the courtroom was no longer just a place of justice, it had become a theater of truth exposed to all. Adeline Carter, aware of the importance of this moment, spoke. "This case goes beyond this court. The truth must be heard and justice served. We have a responsibility to repair what the system left broken." Whitmore, for the first time, felt fear rising within her. The media storm was inevitable. Every journalist, every spectator, every citizen who followed the case would learn the details of her mistakes. She had always believed that her power and authority would be enough to protect her. But faced with the strength of one determined boy, she understood that nothing could stop the coming wave. Michael, standing alongside his father and Adeline Carter, felt strangely calm despite the chaos outside. His mission wasn't to seek fame, it was to reveal the truth and ensure justice for his mother. And now, thanks to this national attention, his voice could no longer be ignored. The whole world was going to hear Michael Johnson, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the hearing were a whirlwind for Judge Margaret Whitmore. The media relentlessly replayed excerpts from the hearing, in which Michael Johnson directly accused her of his mother's death. Each report, each article, exposed her mistakes and negligence, leaving little room for defense. Whitmore now found herself under the scrutiny of a judicial commission examining her conduct. Her colleagues, usually discreet and supportive, were few and far between. Even those closest to her seemed hesitant to defend her. She realized that her reputation, which she had protected all her life, was crumbling under the pressure of a truth she could no longer deny. Michael, meanwhile, continued to receive support from District Attorney Adeline Carter and civil rights attorneys. Together, they compiled all the evidence Whitmore had ignored, strengthening the case against the judge. The documents clearly showed that Whitmore's rash decisions had cost Angela Johnson her life and endangered other potential victims. In her now empty and silent office, Whitmore looked at herself in the mirror. The reflection she saw was no longer that of the powerful and undisputed judge. It was that of a woman confronting her own failures, her choices, and their devastating consequences. Fear and remorse mingled with a suppressed anger at herself. David Johnson and his son Michael watched the judge's reaction from afar, but their goal wasn't revenge. They wanted reparations, recognition of the truth, and assurances that justice would finally be done. Michael, in particular, was beginning to understand the true weight of justice. It wasn't simply about exposing the guilty party, but about transforming the system so that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. The courtroom had been the scene of a moral confrontation, but now the battle was moving on to another level, that of legal and personal consequences. Whitmore had to respond, and Michael, despite his young age, had set in motion a process that could not be stopped. The weight of justice was no longer an abstract concept for Michael, it was tangible, immediate, and beginning to change the lives of everyone involved. For Whitmore, it was a painful lesson; for Michael, it was a step toward reparation and hope that the system might finally acknowledge its mistakes. The whole city was talking about Michael Johnson. Television interviews, newspaper articles, and viral videos on social media portrayed him as a symbol of courage and justice. Citizens, inspired by the strength of a 13-year-old boy, rallied to demand reforms to the justice system. In the courtroom, Whitmore felt increasingly isolated. Every day, the pressure mounted: journalists, investigative committees, and public criticism gave her no respite. Her authority seemed to be eroding before her eyes, and every decision was now scrutinized and judged by millions of eyes. Michael, accompanied by his father David and prosecutor Adeline Carter, continued to provide additional evidence and testimony. But he never acted out of revenge. His goal remained clear: to ensure justice for his mother and all those who had been ignored by the system. One afternoon, as Michael left the courthouse, he was greeted by spontaneous applause. Strangers shook his hand, thanking him for giving them hope and showing that even a young boy could stand up to a corrupt system. For the first time, he felt his voice had the power to transform the world around him. Whitmore, in her office, now deserted by her assistants and colleagues, reread the evidence and testimony she had once ignored. She realized that Michael was not only courageous, he embodied the integrity every judge should uphold. His actions had exposed not only his mistakes, but also the need for a radical change in the way the court operated. The judge took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "This boy, he has more courage and honor than I do." For Michael, this silent recognition was not enough. But he understood that every step he took brought truth closer to justice. His courage had already transformed the courtroom, and now it was transforming public opinion. The courtroom, once a theater of unquestioned authority, was now a place where one young boy's courage, truth, and determination redefined power. Michael Johnson was no longer just a teenager accusing a judge; he had become a living symbol of a justice system that could be heard, respected, and defended, even in the face of those who believed themselves to be above the law. The following weeks were marked by upheaval in the judicial system. Judge Margaret Whitmore, confronted with evidence of her negligence, was suspended pending a formal inquiry. The media, now fascinated by Michael Johnson's story, followed every step of the proceedings, showing the world the courage of a young boy who had dared to defy authority. Michael and his father, David Johnson, stood in the courtroom, watching the courtroom transform. Prosecutor Adeline Carter, who had supported Michael from the beginning, approached and said, "You did what few adults would have the courage to do. Your voice changed the system." Michael smiled, tired but happy. He knew nothing would bring his mother back, but he had achieved what was even more precious: the truth was acknowledged and justice finally begun. Forgotten victims, like his mother, finally had a voice, and those responsible for negligence and corruption could no longer hide. The entire town paid tribute to Michael. Ceremonies were held, and his name became synonymous with courage and integrity. Even children his own age heard about him and were inspired to speak out, to denounce injustices, and to believe that even the voice of one could change the world. Whitmore, confronted with the reality of her mistakes, understood that justice required more than a robe and a gavel. It required listening, protecting, and acting with integrity. For her, this lesson was painful but necessary. Michael, looking at the picture of his mother on his desk, whispered, "Mom, I kept my promise. Justice has been served." And in that moment, he knew that true victory was not just about denouncing the judge, it was about transforming pain into strength, giving a voice to those who had none, and showing that courage and truth could triumph over injustice. The courtroom was no longer just a place of procedures and laws, it had become a living symbol of resilience, hope, and change. And Michael Johnson, the boy who dared to speak the truth, had paved the way for a future where justice was no longer just a word, but a reality accessible to all.